Hello and welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation. Today we are in Revelation chapter 20, and I have to tell you that this chapter is one of the most debated chapters in the Bible. And we will talk about that in just a minute, but let me start by reading it. Chapter 20. And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil, or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony for Jesus, and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand of the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. All right, so there is some clear application here for everybody, regardless of what point of view you take about this chapter. But before we get to that, let's talk about some of the prevailing views about how to approach this chapter. And the interesting thing is that for some reason this topic, the millennium, which comes from Latin of 1,000 years, mil años in Spanish, millennium, has come to be the defining way that people use when identifying how they interpret the end times. And those fall into three major camps. You have the premillennialists, the amillennialists, and the post-millennialists. So, what do each of these believe? Basically, they have to do with what does this 1,000 years, what is it, how does it look like? So the premillennialists believe that Jesus will return and will set up a literal kingdom for 1,000 years. Although many recognize that the number 1,000 is a symbolic number, as we've seen the number 1,000 being symbolic in the rest of the book. So they say it doesn't have to be a literal 1,000 years, but that it is a literal kingdom where the devil has been tied up and God and his people are in charge for a long, complete period of time, represented by 1,000 years. And this happens after Christ's return. So that's why it's called premillennialism, because Jesus' return is before the millennial reign. Now, amillennialists um, believe that this chapter is not talking about a literal kingdom set up after the return of Christ for 1,000 years, but rather this chapter is speaking symbolically of the time that we are living in now, the time between Christ's ascension and his second coming. And they would say, does not Christ have all authority now? He said that in Matthew 28, all authority has been given to me. Is not Christ reigning? Are his people not on the earth? And so they believe that this time that we are living in is what this passage is talking about. And I'll read a little bit more about this in a little bit. Um, but millennialism basically means don't believe in the millennium. But I'll talk about that again in a minute. It's just like uh, atheist is atheist, meaning don't believe in God. Or so. All right. Then the third one is post millennialist, and post millennialists basically believe that Christians will help establish God's reign on the earth, that we are working as his representatives on the earth, and we will set up a, a godly kingdom on the earth that will be active um, for 1,000 years. It's a literal kingdom, a literal time of perfect peace and utopia. And then after that has been set up, then Christ will return. So let's talk historically. Sorry guys, this one might be a little bit longer because there's a lot of stuff to talk here. And and honestly, like I said at the beginning, this is one of the most debated questions in theology. If you go to any seminary anywhere in the world and you take a basic uh, systematic theology class, this is going to be a major section where you're going to be asked to analyze and to decide which one convinces you. That's if you go to a good seminary. Other seminaries, they're still going to talk about it, but they're going to tell you why the one they believe is right and why the others are wrong. But a good seminary is going to look at all of them and allow you to decide. But historically speaking, the earliest church fathers were all what we would call premillennialists, or more specifically, historical or classical premillennialists, because they believed in a literal 1,000 year reign of Christ after his second coming. And we see this in the writings of different church fathers, like Papias, who, who said that the Apostle John promised a literal millennial kingdom. In the second century, in the early second century, which is the early 100s, Justin Martyr talked about a premillennial perspective that Jesus would return and then set up a 1,000 year reign. In the later 100s, which is the later second century, Irenaeus also said that he thought of it as a literal 1,000 year reign, and he said that you should be careful not to allegorize the passage. However, by the fourth century, which is the 300s, things had really changed. The Christian historian, or the Christian historian Eusebius records that basically at that point, which is the fourth century, the 300s, almost every Christian believed that the millennium represented the current age we were living in. And so that became the dominant view, what you would call amillennial, that this is the millennium that this is talking about. And in 431, at the Council of Ephesus, they declared that a belief in a literal millennial kingdom after the return of Christ was simply superstition. So this was the accepted doctrine of the church starting officially in 431. And it was the most widely held throughout Christian history. And this was true all the way up until the 1800s. So we're talking from the 300s to the 1800s. Pretty much every notable Christian theologian is what we would today call an amillennialist. That includes people like St. Augustine. It includes people like John Calvin. It includes people like Martin Luther. They were all what we would call amillennialists. And then in the 1800s, postmillennialism really began to grow and began to be popular as they were kind of idealistic about setting up Christian societies. You're talking about the 17, 1800s. They're coming out of the Reformation. They're coming out of the Enlightenment, and they're trying to establish new countries like the United States and new following different kinds of societies. And what they think they're going to set up these better kingdoms on the earth that will live up to this ideal and become godly kingdoms. Um, we tend to look at this and be like, that was kind of crazy. But at that point in history, they felt like everything was going on an upward trajectory, that things were getting really better. And they took this as a mandate to evangelize and to disciple. And so, actually, postmillennialists were very evangelistic because they believed that we as the church had the responsibility to establish God's kingdom on the earth so that Christ could return. And and some of the greatest preachers of the Great Awakenings were postmillennialists. And the Great Awakenings were times of great revival in the Americas and in Europe. So people like Jonathan Edwards and Charles Finney, they were postmillennialists and saw their view as being a motivation and a mandate for missions and evangelism. But rising up in the 1830s, oh, hold on, before I say that, what happened to postmillennialism? Because today almost no one believes in postmillennialism. What happened to postmillennialism was World War I and World War II at the beginning of the second century. Because I told you they thought everything was on the up and up, everything was getting better, everything was progressing. They're modern societies, intelligent, logical, Christian societies. And then these advanced, modern Christian societies all went to these major wars and destroyed millions and millions and millions of people. And you got to remember that, for instance, Nazi Germany was predominantly a Lutheran country. And so they saw this as Christian societies had just completely failed. And that's when people kind of became disillusioned with postmillennialism. So just a little point of history. Okay, anyway, in the 1830s, so this is before World War II, but there started to emerge a renewed view of premillennialism. But it was different than the historical version. So premillennialism came back in the sense that the new premillennialists, starting in the 1830s, starting specifically with the teaching of a man named John Darby, they went back to the idea that Jesus would return and then there would be a millennium kingdom. So that's why they're called premillennialists. But John Darby established a whole theology that is called dispensationalism that had to do with how is God working in history at different times. And so he would say, for instance, that in the Old Testament, God's dispensation was for Israel, and God was working with Israel. But Israel had turned away. He sent Christ, and who comes to Christ? The Gentiles. The church is established, and he believed that so there was the age of Israel, then there was the age of the church, and the church replaced Israel as God's chosen people. And so they would go through history. Now we were living in the church age where the church replaced Israel. But before the second coming of Christ, he would Jesus would come in the clouds and rapture up the church, ending the church age, and then he would deal once again with Israel throughout the 7 year Great Tribulation, and then he would return for the second coming and have his 1,000 year kingdom. This is the most popular interpretation today. And it started in the 1830s by a man named John Darby. And John Darby's theology and his notes were included in the Scofield edition of the Bible that became the most widely used Bible in the English-speaking world. And so everybody was using a Bible that had Darby's notes in it. So everyone read the Bible according to John Darby's perspective, making this premillennial dispensational view explode. And it became the one that, I mean, everybody believed. When I was a kid, I didn't hear anything else. And you've heard of this because the Left Behind series is like the major picture of a dispensational premillennial interpretation of this passage. And so everybody has heard of this, but not everybody has heard of historical premillennialism, amillennialism, or postmillennialism. An interesting thing happened with Left Behind. Left Behind became both the greatest advertisement for dispensational premillennialism, and it also became the biggest driver of people turning away from it. Because people read the books and said, well, wait a minute, I want to go back and study this. And as they went back and studied it, and they started looking not just from this perspective, but starting to look at other historical perspectives and different theological frameworks, they began to say, I'm not sure I believe this. So an interesting thing has happened since the Left Behind novels happened. And Left Behind, they were coming out like when I was in college. So they're not that old, although I am getting older. But we're talking about 20 years. In the last 20 years, there has been an explosion of diversity in, at least in evangelical uh, churches, concerning perspectives. And a lot of seminarians particularly have gone back to a historical premillennial view or an amillennial view. Um, Particularly, young Calvinists tend to be amillennial. Why? Because John Calvin was, as I said. But plenty of other non-Calvinist evangelicals are too. But I wanted to read something that Scott McKnight wrote about this. And Scott McKnight, in his book, Revelation for the Rest of Us, he basically is kind of saying that he's amillennial, but I just wanted to read this perspective. He says, we are frequently asked what our view of Revelation is. And the question is often framed in terms of the millennium. Are you premillennial or amillennial or postmillennial? We answer back, why is the so-called literal physical millennium the interpretive framework for reading the book of Revelation? The millennium, regardless of your view, is a sideshow in this book at best. 3 verses are the grand sum of verses about the millennium in Revelation. The question itself builds on a premillennialist foundation, assuming there is one. This group charges that the most common view of church history, amillennialism, denies the millennium. That's what the in amillennialism means. Another quite popular view in the history of the church is that Christ will return after the millennium, a postmillennial return. But to call one view amillennial is inaccurate, for the amillennialist believes in a millennium, just not in a literal one, affirming that it refers instead to the church age. You could call amillennialists symbolic millennialists, while the premillennialists are literal physical millennialists. Postmillennialists tend to be literal too. The bigger issue is that Revelation should never be read through the framework of the millennium. Doing so is a colossal example of missing the whole point of the book. A better question is, ignoring the millennium entirely, what is your view of the book of Revelation? Our answer? It is an apocalyptic prophetic book revealing the evils of the empire and summoning readers to a discerning, dissident discipleship as we live into the New Jerusalem. So he's advocating here for amillennialism, but he's saying that the whole idea, the whole debate is all based on a premillennialist point of view, which is an interesting thing. And he's saying, why are we defining how we read Revelation by 3 verses? And I think that's a fair point. We need to think about that. And so I believe that an honest Christian perspective has to say that while it is an interesting thing to think about and to apply, it's not the most important thing. Now, my father always called himself a pan-millennialist because he believes it will all pan out in the end. And people ask me sometimes, Jerry, what are you? Are you a premillennialist, an amillennialist? And I'll often say it depends on the day. And the reason being is these different perspectives all have valid arguments for them using the scriptures. They've all been held by good, faithful theologians and Christians throughout history. And so a lot of it has to do with what perspective are you reading this from and where are you starting? So if you're starting here, then you're going to say, "Oh, absolutely. It's 1,000-year reign after the come of Christ." But if you're looking from a wider biblical perspective, starting with like the New Testament, Paul, even thinking of the Old Testament, you might not come to that conclusion. So they're important questions, but ultimately nobody really knows. And good Christians have held different positions throughout history. But here are some things that we can see in this passage and we can know regardless of what our millennial position is. One of the first things I want to point out is that during this time, it says that Satan is tied up and he cannot deceive the nations anymore. So people tend to think of this as a utopia. But Satan isn't the root of sin. Maybe that's the wrong terms, but like Satan isn't the only cause of sin. We are sinful. What it says here is that Satan is not free to deceive the nations. That doesn't mean they can't deceive themselves. Because at this point, it's not saying that sin isn't dealt with. And I think that that's clear because when Satan is released again, the whole world turns against Christ again. So, not the whole world, but most of the world. So it tells us there's something about the human nature that we are turned against God. That even if the devil isn't active, we're just ready to accept it when he is. Even if we had 1,000 years without his temptation, the second he comes in, bam, we would do it again. So if you've ever asked the question or said like, if I was Adam and Eve in the garden, I might not have done that. Well, here it's kind of that situation. There's no devil here tempting them, but the minute he's there, they all turn against God. So I think it's telling us something about the human condition, that we have our own desires and a nature turned against God, that we don't need the devil tempting us to do evil. We can do it on our own. The next thing I would like to talk about is just that we see kind of contrasts specifically between the first resurrection and the second death. So what we have here really is a first resurrection, a second resurrection, and a first death and a second death. think everybody looking at this would have to say that that is the case. Um, the first death is the human death that every human being is appointed to face. But we see here, he says, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony for Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received his mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So these are the people who have been faithful to Christ. So while he's specifically saying those who have been beheaded, which, by the way, was the way that Roman citizens were executed. So that was the most common way. Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen. He was beheaded. That was their way of executing citizens. So it's interesting that he uses that because in these cities there were probably a lot of Roman citizens. But anyway, but he's focusing on because of their testimony for Jesus, because of the word of God, and because they had not worshipped. So while he specifically mentions martyrs here, I think that we can say that any who have not turned away from God, any who have remained faithful and have not bowed to the beast, will be a part of this first resurrection. And what do they get to do? They get to reign with Christ. And it says, blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them. So all people are destined to the first death. All people are destined to a resurrection. Some people, those who have not followed the beast or the devil, will be raised in the first resurrection. Later we saw that when God is ready to judge, he is going to raise everyone. It says the earth and sky fled from his presence, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And it says, and the sea gave up its dead. So all the dead of the earth are going to be raised at the second resurrection in order to face judgment. So first death, first resurrection, second resurrection are those who weren't part of the first resurrection. They were people who had followed the beast, who had followed Satan. Now they are judged according to the books, according to their deeds. And what happens? Those whose names are not found in the book of life face the second death. So this is telling us about the eternal destiny of humanity. We can be blessed. There's another beatitude, a blessing, by being a part of the first resurrection. Or we can suffer the second death and be tossed into the lake of fire, along with Satan, the beast, his false prophet, his idol, death and Hades. Even death is going to be thrown into the lake of fire. So that's the second death. So that's just something to consider here is these different resurrections and these different deaths. Then we have to understand the good news that Satan is doomed. Satan's going to be tied up, however that works. He's going to be released. He's going to get the earth to turn against God again. And what's going to happen? God is going to destroy him and throw him into the lake of fire. That's good news for us, people. Satan is doomed. And God will judge all people. This is something we can take from this. So, I agree with Scott McKnight here. While it's an interesting question to discuss and debate, the bigger issue is what is this saying to us? What is the book of Revelation saying to us? And the book of Revelation we've been seeing has been saying to us, be faithful to Christ. Don't accept the dragon. Don't accept the beast. Don't accept his false prophet. Stand against it. They're going to bring things against you. They're going to try to tear you down. They're going to kill you. Stand firm. Stand faithful. Because in the end, Satan and the beast are doomed, and God's people are blessed. Because if they have not bowed to the beast, they have their names written in the book of life, and they are going to be standing and ruling with Christ as priests in his kingdom. All right, that's enough for today. Thank you. God bless you. I will see you next time as we continue our study.